productivity and really boost growth. So yeah, it's a real honour to be here and to have this conversation. I think reflecting on what we're trying to look at today, I do think it's important that we sing about the success story of connectivity in the UK. We're competitive. There's been huge success in terms of rollout, and as I said, pandemic would have been so much harder if we didn't have that kind of key foundation of connectivity to help us. And yeah, I checked, I think broadband just before I left today, and we're at over 65% now for full fibre. So it's great. It's great news. I think on productivity, Tech UK recently did some polling with Public First, and it found that adopting new technologies like AI, even cloud, which is actually a very established technology now, 54% of those we surveyed said that was key. Adopting those new technologies was key to boosting productivity. So there's a real clear need, and we fully support that and want to address that. Mentioning Microsoft and Google and other companies that we represent coming to the UK, delivering those services, and I think it's accessing those services that points to the need for this resilience. So Ofcom talking about resilience guidance, having no single points of failure, resilient architectures, how we think about governance and framework, and reflecting on my experience, we were talking about the Telecom Security Act, something that I've worked on very closely for our members, and really it's of course it's important about removal of high-risk vendors, and making sure there's resilience in the supply chain, but crucially, and what I think is forgotten, is it's about having that security governance framework in mind. So it's how you approach network security and resilience. I think that's really of crucial importance. And fully supportive of Vorbos's research, super interesting, and look forward to the panel. Thank you.
Brilliant. John.
Thank you very much, Alan. For those of you who are perhaps unfamiliar with Business London, we are a cross-sector campaigning business membership body with the mission to make London the best city in the world in which to do business. So, as you'd expect, we take a keen interest in the quality, quantity and price of digital networks and services, for those are at the very core of business operations, whether that's serving customers, managing internal operations, or indeed supporting remote working. A London that is well connected physically and digitally makes doing business cheaper, cleaner and more efficient. It boosts productivity and therefore growth, not just in the capital, but across the whole of the country. As the Assembly report sets out, 83% of UK businesses surveyed reported that communication services are so fundamental to them that they could not function without them. And whilst good progress is being made on the rollout of full fibre to premises across London, it's still just 2/3 of the premises here which are covered. Mobile coverage is patchy, with areas of not spots across London and varying bandwidth capacity where coverage does exist. And so this is one reason why we run the London Gigabit Connectivity Network, which brings together London's leading fibre and mobile operators with key representatives of London government to look at how we can accelerate the full rollout of both fibre and 5G technologies. Last year, we ran a commission looking at London as a place post-pandemic to see what needed to change and to evolve. And one of the key recommendations from that report is to seek to create one technological ecosystem for the whole of the city, so that we've got not just real-time information on things that matter to us, like transport services, but also we're able to enjoy the full benefit of all that is around us, all that the city has to offer, as well as creating opportunities for new businesses and for new public services. So it is deeply encouraging to see an innovative business like Vorbos investing to deploy fast fibre across the centre of London for business customers. I'm contractually obliged to remind you about some of the key statistics about central London. The central activity zone where we are now accounts for just 0.01% of the country's landmass, but it's responsible for 11% of the whole UK's economic output, for about 7% of the jobs, and Minister, it pays an awful lot in taxation, including 20% of business rates. So it is somewhat concerning to see from the report the figure you mentioned earlier, Matthew, that the costs of connectivity outages are about £6 billion to the London economy. As you might expect at Business London, we're strongly supportive of the role of competition in driving competitiveness in the telecoms market. And I should just say, we also very much welcome, Minister, the government's decision to extend the remit of utility regulators, including Ofcom, to be supportive of growth. We think that's very important. But we also recognise the complexity inherent in regulating markets where competition is advancing, but legacy issues remain. I think Ofcom is right to focus on transparency around service quality as the best first step to supporting competition. If customers cannot easily find out data on reliability, then how can they make an informed choice? And of course, we must also remember that fast, reliable connectivity is not an end in itself, but rather a means towards unlocking the transformative potential of data. That's why we led work to create the London Data Charter, which sets out a framework for the private sector and the public sector in London to share data and to collaborate, and thus to create a community of data experts and data owners to harness the power of data to the benefit of London and the wider UK. Ubiquitous, affordable, reliable, digital infrastructure is at the heart of London's future competitiveness. It's the cornerstone of growing productivity. And so it's a great pleasure to be here for the launch of this report and the discussion today.
Fantastic. Thank you, John. We're going to turn to Q&A now. I'm afraid I'm going to abuse the position of chair. I'm going to ask one myself to the panel, but please do prepare your questions just for a few minutes' time. So, John, you touched upon just there the growth duty that government has introduced, I believe, last year. I'd love to get a bit more, dig a little bit more into that. I mean, this is obviously something where the capacity for innovation and growth is clearly very strong. I'd love it if we could dig a little bit more into that. Where do you see what more government could be doing and what could be helped through this growth duty? What do we need to see and perhaps to the rest of the panel? So I'd love to get your views on that as well.
Well, I think from the perspective of the regulator, the critical part of the growth duty, and I think this applies across the utility regulators, but particularly in telecommunications where there is such a rapid pace of innovation, I think the real challenge is to balance that opportunity with some of the known costs. So, for example, there is a tendency in regulation always to focus on prices charged to vulnerable consumers. This is an important duty. It's not something that should not be taken seriously. But equally, if you simply drive it, you create all kinds of constraints on the ability to price, to deliver new services, to price the delivery of new services, all of which can be burdensome. So I think it's, as with so many things in life, it's about achieving a sense of balance. And that's why it's important that duty's in there rather than just sort of implicitly hovering.
Sophie, anything to add on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that Tech UK fully supported and called for the growth duty to be applied, obviously our sector being Ofcom and not just telecoms, of course. Ofcom, you know, we do a huge amount of work on things like online safety, for instance. And really it was for us to, our vision was that we could see a regulatory system delivered by Ofcom that could adapt and sort of understand and flex with the pace of technological change, because the UK is, you know, it's got this huge ambition to be a tech and science superpower, and really the regulatory system should enable that, finding its own path between what's happening in the US, what's happening in the EU, for example. So having those accountability mechanisms, I think, is hugely important. And crucially, I think, for going back to the telecoms picture, understanding the business environment that the telecoms operators are kind of working in and investing in, because that investment picture has slightly changed in recent times. It's very challenging. And so, yeah, having the growth duty applied to Ofcom, we see great benefits too. And we call for other things as well, just for Ofcom to be more effectively resourced. It's seen its duties grow exponentially in recent times. So I see that from the Telecom Security Act. That's a huge new regime that it's enforcing. So agree as well with John's points.
We'll give a shameless plug to forthcoming onward research that's going to be looking at exactly this question. Not that Sophie knew about this, but so yeah, looking at how regulators can deal with emerging technologies, and so stay tuned for that in the months to come. James, can I turn to you next on this one, and then I'll turn to you.
Of course. When I look through the raft of legislation that sits on Ofcom regarding its duties. I think when, as an industry, we first heard about a consideration of an additional duty on the regulator, you think, oh, this sounds like another raft of red tape. But when you step back and look at what the growth duty is fundamentally trying to do, it shouldn't be seen as an additional duty. It should be seen as essentially trying to help those regulators navigate that space more broadly. And it's important to bear in mind there should always be, and it kind of touches on points that John has made and Julia has made regarding to cultivate that environment of competition. You really don't want a regulator just going into a space or intervening for the sake of it. There really should be a bit of a burden of proof against that. And I think the growth duty is a great way to essentially ask that question. Any regulator really should be considering the productivity and growth considerations of any intervention in the market. And that essentially synthesizes that to be a direct question to any regulator when they're thinking about what they're doing. And in that sense, when we were looking at commissioning this piece of research, we didn't want the focus of the research to simply be, well, do businesses still find this hard to navigate? That's absolutely part of the question. But an additional consideration should be, well, what is the impact of that difficulty to navigate that market on the UK economy and our productivity more broadly?
Yeah.
And it's those two pieces that go together that I think give a much richer view of what are the potential pros and cons of trying to make it easier for businesses to navigate competition. It's not just an issue of business potential harm regarding the difficulty of picking what is best for them. It is also trying to create an environment where operators like Lopez and many others are incentivized to continually improve the resilience of their networks because of that productivity gain. So I'm an enormous fan of the growth duty, and I think it creates a framework that asks the right questions and raises the appropriate burden of proof for any regulator.
Minister?
Yeah, I would think one of the challenges we have as ministers, is that we have to think about a wide range of challenges, and sometimes the remit of a regulator is fairly narrow, and they're not necessarily thinking of other aspects that create challenges for consumers, but also for us as an economy. So one of the examples in telecoms is looking at consumer prices and the competitiveness in the market in that regard, but not necessarily thinking about whether our networks have enough money to be able to, our telecom operators have enough money to invest in networks in a way that's going to give us long-term productivity benefits, in a way that's going to allow us to compete on a global level with other nations that are putting huge amounts of money into their networks, and whether there is a long-term viable business model for some of our telcos. And so, we very much welcome a broadening out of the remit. But we also have to be very vigilant about how our regulators are operating generally. It's been suggested there's a lot more, there's been a pretty wide expansion of their remits, particularly Ofcom. I mean, it's now going to be taking on board online safety duties amongst many other things. And I think we as ministers have to make sure that we have the right balance, right size of our regulators, and that there's sufficient cooperation between regulators. And actually that's now happening between the FCA, the CMA, Ofcom and the ICO are now having much closer regulatory cooperation, because so many of the new emerging issues coming down the line are ones where you need a much broader overview than a single regulator. So I just think I'm very glad to hear you're doing some research on this, Alan, but it's something that's quite a live discussion in government as to whether the size, scope and remit of regulators is right, and it's something DBT is looking into quite considerably as well.
I noticed that the government announced yesterday the Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum. They've just launched the AI aspect of that for sort of helping with that coordination across regulators for such a thing as cross-cutting as AI, which is, I think, a good thing to do. There's lots more that needs to be done. Can I open up to the audience for some questions at all, please? Lord Vasey, you're on the edge of your seat there. Would you like to ask anything at all?
Well, I think this is very important, this report. I think it's groundbreaking. What are we going to do about the constant theft of telecoms equipment from the ground? Isn't there a criminal element here that the police need to address as well?
I think that's one for you, Minister.
Well, I mean, I think certainly when it comes to fibre optics, and then Borbos might disagree with me, it's not a common problem that's raised with me by a lot of the telcos. So, I mean, we already have criminal offences that can be taken against people that have perpetrated crimes of this nature. I think there's a challenge in terms of identifying who has committed any damage to infrastructure. I know this is something that Borbos is concerned about, and we've established much closer working groups with industry, particularly since the pandemic, where they serve as a forum for highlighting whether any of these issues are coming through. I mean, to be blunt, it's not something that is raised with me regularly by industry. If this is a much more widespread problem, then I'm happy to be corrected. But I'm sure that James is going to tell me that this is a very widespread problem.
Look,
James?
thank you, Alan. I think this touches on an issue that covers a few different topics. It certainly includes theft of copper, but that's not something that, as a wholly fibre network, we don't see that issue. But more broadly, the topic of malicious activity, vandalism. There has been some excellent work done by DC or convened by DC in the last few months regarding trying to just push the industry to coordinate on a more regular basis where it's reacting to these kind of incidents. But more broadly, I think there is a bit of a question, probably more to Home Office and our police forces, regarding how do you react to an incident in real time. So I'm speaking at a very high level basis, but broadly, if there is an incident in an exchange or a mobile mast, that will be treated usually as quite a very high priority incident because of the amount of customers or businesses that are being served by that infrastructure. Whereas if there is an attack on a green cabinet at the end of the road, the assumption is, well, that's not as high a priority because it's not serving as many customers. Now, that is a reflection of network architecture about 15 years ago. That's not a good reflection of network architecture now. Now you can have for consumer networks, you can have a roadside cabinet serving several thousand people, so it can be pretty much the same as an exchange. And you can have a subduct in London that is now so congested with backhaul that if you literally took out 3 or 4 outside, you could wipe out a good chunk of central London's economic activity for a couple of days if you were really targeted with it. But if you engage the police on that issue, so every network operator will have that kind of incident happen sometimes, it's a very hard job to take them through why it's so important. Some forces are better than others, and we've had that discussion with some different network operators. It does seem to be more regionalised rather than necessarily a national issue. But I think there's definitely more that can be done to facilitate a conversation between police forces, Home Office, and the most up-to-date way of architecting a network, so that can inform priority. I don't think it's there at the moment, but I do appreciate that landscape is always moving, so that's a constant conversation that needs to be had. And I very much do appreciate the work that DC has done in the last couple of months to help address some of those issues, particularly on compliance about operators working in each other's network asset.
Sophie, anything to add on that?
Yeah, we haven't seen it at Tech UK as a huge priority issue. We have seen notable stories. And of course, it's extremely irritating, as you say, a cabinet at the end of the road getting damaged. It can cause huge frustration. I think for us, absolutely echo the collaboration point, and I think that points back to the growth duty comment for Ofcom. It enables closer collaboration between whether the regulator or industry and government. We fully support that, and innovating, and you talked about new ways of building and designing and delivering connectivity. I think one of the ways that collaboration and innovations come together is the National Underground Asset Register, which has had a very interesting coming together of everyone who owns underground assets, and it enables that checking. It's all digital. It's a great piece of work. Some issues, of course, but we fully support NUAR as a kind of concept. And I know the Minister mentioned subsea cables. I think that's actually one of the things that I think is most crucial to the UK's kind of resilience and its digital economy, considering how vulnerable those could be and how pivotal they are to the UK's connectivity. We are an island, and there's some major services that sit on top of those that we absolutely rely on, not least our financial services sector. So, thinking about it in the main with close collaboration and innovation would be the Tech UK perspective on that one.
John, did you have anything to add on that one?
Well, I don't know, I'm afraid, quite how telecoms infrastructure theft stacks up against transport or energy infrastructure theft, which is what one reads about I guess, the most. I suppose I'd just say I would like the police across the UK to take business crime in the round a bit more seriously than they do.
Brilliant. Sorry, did I see a question over here at all? Yes, sorry, lady there.
Hi, thanks. Emma Shearer, I'm from City Fibre. We're one of those companies out there putting up poles, not too many, but connecting 3.5 million customers, both consumers and businesses across the country. I think it's been really interesting to hear about that kind of link between these new networks and productivity. And I was just kind of wondering if the panel, given that these had any views, given that the kind of rollout has been so successful, we've got so much of the country can now access this at their doorstep, but aren't yet taking it up. So I was wondering if the panel had any views on what more we can do as industry, as government, as kind of anyone interested, to help people understand what's there, what the opportunity is, so that we can kind of reap that benefit in full.
Great question. Minister, can I turn to you first on that one?
Well, yeah, can I say first of all, without sucking up to, but City Fibre has been a really valuable partner in our Project Gigabit contracts in particular, and in providing that kind of the heat of competition that has spurred other companies to speed up their own rollouts. I think it's been really very helpful to us as a government, and it means that we're getting connectivity to a far greater number of people much faster. So thank you to you and other companies that have bid for our Project Gigabit contracts. It's much appreciated. Yes, I mean, one of the challenges I think that companies find is whether people are taking up those gigabit offers in sufficient numbers. And I think that is a challenge. I mean, most people have the need for a bit of streaming, some work calls and so on. I think that will start to change considerably over time. And I think one of the things I've been trying to do as government is trying to have more connectivity for ourselves in terms of some of the big infrastructure projects, so that we can prove the demand for some of the technologies that are coming down the line. The fact is that, as I mentioned, we will be seeing more of those sort of healthcare applications, more education, more company activity that requires a much greater capacity in relation to the network. So I think some of that will take time, and then the customer base will follow accordingly. But in some respects, the challenge at the moment is there is simply, you don't have people connecting 100 devices at the moment, and that will change as we have more connected homes and so on. We've considered about the idea of comms campaigns and so on, but it's a bit of a challenge until you really have the use cases there.
Sophie, any views on, do you think the government should be doing comms campaigns and that sort of thing?
It's a complicated one on comms campaigns. I know the government position on that. So, but talking of government's role, the digitisation of public services and how they are delivered to citizens across the UK, I think that could, really shift the dial in terms of taking up advanced connectivity, whether that's mobile or fibre at the home, etc. Of course, it's a hugely challenging, question to ask. How do we boost adoption and take up? I think bringing it back to our conversation today and the Vorbos research that Assembly have delivered, the resilience of fibre optic cable is much greater than it is for any copper base. That's why copper is being retired. It's why things like 3G is being sunsetted, because these are older technologies. So if we can sing that song of it's not just about speed, it's also about the resilience and reliability of fibre infrastructure across residential and business, I think that could really help. But I think public sector's got a role to play as well as an anchor tenant.
John, any views on driving uptake in London for businesses?
Build it and they will come, but not as quickly as you'd like, as I think the experience. I think there's much in what the Minister said about timing. It's difficult to know what the benefits are of really high, reliable speed and bandwidth until you've experienced them. And it's difficult to get people to experience it until they see some added value to them in so doing. I do think there's a role for all of us in the industry and more broadly around the sort of leading by example, by which I mean providing really good examples. So I think case studies, the stories of individual businesses and organisations that have invested and that has enabled them to, is the sort of stuff which I think can help move adoption a little bit more quickly.
James, anything to add on that?
I look at the City Fibre model with envy, and you might say, well, what on earth would you be drawing that comparison before? Because the assets are so different. City Fiber's network is they're looking at consumer, small business, gigabit-capable connectivity rollout, and particularly now with the working BDUK on the state aid remedy. And Vorbos is doing a dedicated to very high bandwidth business. But we have the shared problem in trying to enable our customer to differentiate on the basis of quality. And when I look at the consumer fixed market, as Ofcom would call it, the WLA market, there's been a lot of focus in that area, and rightly so. We've had multiple different rounds of intervention from Ofcom about how contracts should be structured so that consumers are made very aware of the benefit or the pros and cons of the service they're taking. There's automatic compensation in consumer. Ofcom reports on lots of different metrics to inform the consumers to what is the better service, tariff and network. But the business side of things, as we've heard in the report, there's been some incremental progress on that. But it's actually, at the moment, very hard to differentiate on the basis of actually your service level agreements and how you'd compensate because of the historic experience that has sat there. Now, what can be done to drive take-up? I think, therefore, remedies that enable your customer, whether it be consumers, small business, large business, multinationals, whoever that would be, helping them navigate this newly created network-level competition has an enormous benefit. We've talked about some of the productivity benefits that there are. And I think if we are going to cultivate that competitive environment, then lift that to the benefit of the customers we're trying to talk to. Things that make that very salient to the customer when they're actually going out to the market to make that choice, such as, for instance, automating compensation. So you're taking away some of that doubt about, is this real? Now, that's a particular learning from that report where we see a significant improvement in the consumer market, where actually faults were being fixed much more quickly because operators were suddenly on the hook for having to pay out if it wasn't. And the consumer didn't have to chase the operator and sit hours on the phone trying to get it. Actually, if we had that incentive structure in the business connectivity market, talking about some of the productivity benefits we could have, not only would that then drive take-up, because that business is then better enabled to decide, right, I know that one has this particular level of compensation and this other operator does, and I have the faith that it will be automated because that's now the new rule. That just enables a more effective level of competition, and we potentially get the huge productivity gains that we talked to here. So I think that's the way, focusing on where you can make that process simpler and more reliable for whoever your customer is, be it consumer, be it large business, so that they can actually find the connection that's best for their needs. I think that's the path you go down for take-up.
Very interesting. We have 9 or so minutes left. Further questions? Yes, gentleman at the back there.
Good afternoon. I'm Mike Salem from the Consumer Choice Centre. James, you briefly touched on what I was going to ask, which is what are the discussions regarding the backup systems in case something goes down? As consumers, our primary concern is how quickly can you get me on the internet again, not whether I'll get paid or not. Of course, I'll be asking for compensation, but my main concern, whether it's a cyber attack, whether it's a tree that's fallen down on the infrastructure, how quickly can you get me on the internet again, and whether that's something the government is considering, and if so, what are some of the conversations that's going on with the infrastructure builders on that front? Thank you.
James?
I think there are different ways you can try and tackle that question. So one, you could sit there and say, well, we should have a very direct intervention from the regulator to force operators to disclose how often they have an outage, how quickly they fix them, and everyone report on that, and all of that be publicised. But then you've got to weigh that against, is that going to undermine, or is that even fair? Because you've got very different network architectures with very different providers. How would you compare a Vorbos network in central London to a GigaClear network in rural areas? We'll have very different outage times, we'll have very different problems of the list that you've described there. How is that a fair way to generate competition between those networks, or have as a remedy to compare? You're not comparing like for like. But the research touched on that to a sense where the remedy we're talking about here, where it's essentially compensation, it isn't compensation for compensation's sake. No one wants to sell to a customer talking about compensation off the back. because it prompts the question of, well, what's wrong with your network? It's much more the other way around. It's a proxy for reliability. If we all believed and had faith in the compensation claims that operators made, so if every single one had to work and it had to be automated, you would set a baseline where operators could say, I have so much confidence in our ability to fix faults for the kind of example that you have given, I will set my compensation level here. And another operator may say, I can't match that because I'm not as good. Or actually, I am better than that. I can address that problem even quicker, so I'm going to make it here. It becomes a proxy to answer your question. And so using compensation as a proxy for a discussion about resilience is, I think, a much fairer way to answer your question, rather than a very direct intervention where you're not really comparing like for like. I think that's a more honest reflection of the competitive environment we've created, but still answers your problem of, that if I'm very sensitive to outage and I want to know who is best at fixing that, how do I navigate the market to do it?
Sophie, any views on that?
Yeah, just in brief, totally get James's points there, very well made. In terms of getting back online, it's a really hard question to answer because of the complexity of every single setup that every person or business might have, the fault that's happening. I was just talking just before we convened here about an issue we were having in our office, and it wasn't the network itself, it was where our Wi-Fi access points were, and that's actually another layer of complexity when you think about how connectivity infrastructure actually works. It's not just a fibre optic cable that goes to someone's house, it's how that network's configured. It could also be the devices that sit on top of it. There's kind of multiple layers. I think I would just say, I know we're talking here primarily about the fixed side, but in terms of mobile infrastructure, there's, and all connectivity infrastructure, there's so much redundancy built in to build that resilience, to enable all consumers to get back online as soon as possible. It's by its nature designed and architected in that way to have that kind of coming back online as soon as possible.
I think just in the interest of time, unless around the two panelists are particularly keen to come in on that one, I might just open up to one last question in the last few minutes. Yes, gentlemen, just here.
Hi, Tom Corcoran from Qualcomm. Thanks for the really interesting discussion. It came up a couple of times, but it seems like one of the biggest challenges for the telecom sector to boost productivity is operators' ability to continue investing in the most reliable, most secure, and latest technology. Now, we recently had the EU Commission's Digital Infrastructure White Paper looking at the future of the industry. I'd be curious to hear the panel's views on what we need to do here in the UK.
Right, spurring continuous investment. Minister, can I turn to you on that one?
Well, I think one of the biggest live questions is whether there are too many operators, and that's obviously a live investigation currently by the Competition and Markets Authority as to whether we go down from 4 key companies to 3. And I think that's something that we take an interest in as government. While we don't try to influence the regulator, we do have concerns about just what is required to get the levels of investment in our infrastructure that we need to remain competitive, and that's something that we signalled when we launched the wireless infrastructure strategy last year. We want to try and make sure that telcos can be profitable businesses because of the sheer importance of them to our future economic health. And so we also have a whole range of things we're looking at in that paper that we put out, which is about how do you help with use cases when it comes to 5G, for instance. So it's not about consumer 5G so much in the next stage, but how do you show to businesses the applications that you can have in 5G when it comes to low latency and very fast connectivity. So what can we do as a purchaser of technology as government to show the kinds of use cases that can help spur productivity in particular businesses, looking at projects we can do in terms of ports and big transport infrastructure and so on. So, I mean, looking at whether the market has too many players, looking at what we can do as a purchaser, as government, trying to help with some of the technological developments and making sure that we have access to research investment and making sure that we build up an innovative, skilled workforce in the UK so that we get the infrastructure investment right and that we've got the right components and so on. These are all kind of things that are in our wireless infrastructure strategy. Hopefully it's the kind of audience that would actually find that quite an interesting document. If you were a bit more consumer-facing, perhaps I wouldn't even dare mention such nerdery, but yeah.
Brilliant. John, anything to add on that?
Well, I'd just say people invest in infrastructure like they invest in anything else to make a return. And you make a return based on your reading of the market, which will sometimes be right and sometimes be wrong. What I think we can legacy networks and create ever more complicated regimes, which make it very difficult for a new operator to come in with a new project and price that cleanly. And I think we also need to look at some of the other related costs that businesses face. So, for example, putting up lots of 5G points of presence in London is neither cheap, easy, nor nor straightforward to do. So I think sort of sweeping away rules that constrain the deployment of infrastructure, everything from digging up streets to, as I say, putting points of presence for 5G networks is really important too.
Right. Sophie, in the last minute or so, and James, if you want to jump in as well.
Boost take-up, it makes those networks more valuable, and that makes the investment picture rosier, essentially. That would be my first point. And to John's point, planning and those barriers that are in place for before the networks are even built, the removal of those makes deployment quicker, easier and cheaper. Therefore, you're improving that investment picture. So echo John's points.
James, any last
I thought John's comment